morning. Thank you for having me today. I'm going to talk first a little bit about the problems that we're having today in public education and public education reform, and give you a little bit of context for my comments by talking a little bit about my experience in Washington, D.C. as a chancellor of schools there. And then I'm going to talk more on the hopeful side about the things that I think we can do to change the situation in a significant way. So just as a little bit of background, and Charlene gave you some, about 4 years ago I was appointed as the chancellor of the DC public schools. My then boss, Adrian Fenty, sort of swept into office in November of 2006. He was the youngest mayor ever to be elected mayor of Washington, D.C. He was also the only candidate who ever won every single precinct in the city in his election. It was an overwhelming landslide victory, came into office, and on the very first day introduced legislation to the city council that it would allow him to take over mayoral control of the schools. That was granted about 4 months later, and then on June 12th, 2007, which was his first day of having control of the schools, he announced me as his pick for the city's first schools chancellor. Which did not go over particularly well. I was a 37-year-old Korean girl from Toledo, Ohio, who had never run a school, much less a school district. And everyone in the city of Washington, D.C. thought that Adrian Fenty had lost his mind. They thought, why on God's green earth would he think that this is the woman who is going to be able to change the city's schools around? And I have to say that you know, around the afternoon of the first day, I couldn't really argue with them about that. We were a school district that if you were a ninth grader entering into high school in the district, the probability that you would graduate from college was about 9%. We had an achievement gap in our district between where the white students were performing and where the black students were performing of 70 percentage points. That's a 70 percentage point gap between those two races. Of all of the 8th graders in the city's schools, only 8% of them were doing grade level mathematics. 8%, which means that 92% of our young people did not have the skills and knowledge necessary to be productive members of society. And potentially the most disheartening data of all was about our little ones. And what that data said was that when our children came into the system as kindergartners, they were relatively on par with kids who looked like them in other large urban jurisdictions across the country. So not with their suburban counterparts, they were already far behind them, but with kids who looked like them in places like Philadelphia or Cleveland, LA, across the nation. The problem is that the longer they stayed in our system, the worse off they were. By the time they were in the 3rd grade, they were far below their urban counterparts. And this is an interesting statistic, which is that by the time they reached the 4th grade, the poor black 4th graders in New York City were operating 2 full grade levels ahead of the poor black 4th graders in Washington, D.C. So for everyone who wanted to blame the low academic achievement levels of our children on single-parent households and violence in the community and lack of health care, etc., the last time I checked, the poverty in Harlem did not look all that different from the poverty in Southeast Washington, D.C., but the kids in Harlem were 2 grade levels ahead of ours. So we had this incredibly difficult situation that we were faced with because our children were almost better off staying home every day than they were coming to school, where they were almost sure to fall behind. So it was interesting because when I started the job, I would go out to meetings like this, chambers of commerce, Rotary clubs, you know, that sort of thing, and I would give a rousing speech to people about my vision for the public schools, why I thought we could improve what we were doing, and what was interesting was that afterwards, after those speeches, people would inevitably come up to me and say, you know, Michelle, we like you. You are enthusiastic, you seem to be hardworking, you're really motivated, but you are not going to be successful. And I'd always say, gee, thanks. Why do you think so? And they'd say, because schools are a reflection of the communities that they are in. And as long as we have the economic disparities in this country that we do, we are always going to have the educational inequality. They said because in some neighborhoods that are the richer neighborhoods, there are more resources, there's more engagement, you're going to have better schools. And then in other parts of town where poverty, it's poverty-stricken, you have violence, you have all these issues, you are going to have less good schools. That's the way that democracy and capitalism work. And I never believed that that's the way that things had to be, but I also never could figure out exactly the right way to explain to people why I thought a different vision was possible. And about a year and a half into my tenure in DC, I had the good fortune of meeting Warren Buffett. So first of all, never in my life, people, would I ever think that I would have the chance to meet Warren Buffett, but there I was one night in Omaha having a steak with Warren, and over dinner he looked at me and he said, "You know, Michelle, it is very easy to fix the problems in public education in America today." And I said, "Super, Mr. Buffett. Why don't you tell me what that is so I can run back to Washington, D.C. and implement it?" And he said, "All you need to do is make private schools illegal and assign every child to a public school by random lottery." So think about that for a minute. Because if we had done that in D.C., which means that every ambassador's child, every CEO's child, every congressman's child, and the president's 2 children all got assigned to a random DC public school by lottery, which means that a huge proportion of them would be going to Anacostia every day for school, I guarantee you that you would never see a faster movement of resources from one side of the city to the other as you would in that circumstance. And I also very much guarantee you that quickly we would have a system of excellent schools. So in my mind, it's not a matter of, is it possible to ensure that all schools are great? It is. The question in my mind is, do we as the adults in the system have the wherewithal that it would take to make the incredibly difficult decisions necessary to make that a reality for every child? And the very quick answer to that question so far has been no. So I set about trying to change this, and I did not want to close down private schools, nor did I have the power to do so. I did think that it was possible to reform this system that was not working particularly well. And one of the first things that people said to me as I took this challenge on was, "Michelle, you have to figure out where the money is going." And they said that because we were spending almost more money per pupil than any other jurisdiction in the nation, and the results were at the absolute bottom. So we were actually a proof point across the nation for why more money doesn't actually equal better results in education. So it seemed like a pretty good place to start, right? Find out where we're spending the money, and I sent my staff out to go look into it, and very quickly, one of my staff members came back to me and said, "You are not going to believe what I found." He said, "I was looking at the biggest budget line items," and he said, "and I found out that we spend more than $80 million a year in this district transporting a few thousand special education kids through the system to their schools." And so I did the quick back of the envelope math, and it turned out we were spending about $18,000 per kid transporting them to school. And I thought, this is insane. For $18,000, we could buy every kid a Saturn the first year and a driver for the Saturn every year after that, right? So I think to myself, well, I don't know anything about running bus routes, but I know I can do it for cheaper than $18,000 a year per kid. And so I said, great, we're going to make the system more efficient, and we're going to put the money in the classroom. And my assistant said, actually, no. See, the problem is that the DC public schools had done such a poor job of transporting these special education students in the past that they were sued, and now we are under a court order, a consent decree, right? There's a court-appointed special master, and he is responsible for transporting the children, but he's allowed to spend as much money as he wants to. And all we can do is pay the bill. We have no ability to control the costs. And I thought, that is the craziest thing I have ever heard. And he said, that's because you haven't heard my next fact. he said, I was trying to figure out, where are all these kids going to school? Why aren't they going to their neighborhood schools? Why are we busing them so far away to begin with? He said, and it turns out that for a large percentage of these children, we are paying the tuition to send them to private schools because we as the district were not able to meet their needs within the public school system. And I said, well, how exactly does that happen? And he said, well, that's what I asked myself. He said, so I went in and I dug around and I tried to find out. He said, and let me just give you one example of what I found. He said, I found an employee that we have here at the central office, a mid-level employee, and in 1 week she made 2 mistakes. For one child, she did not fill out a form she was supposed to fill out, and in another child, she didn't have a meeting she was supposed to have. And in both cases, this resulted in these 2 children getting sent to a private facility that cost the district $227,000 per child per year. So I thought to myself, I'm going to have to meet this lady. So my assistant calls the woman and says, ma'am, we need you to come to a meeting at the chancellor's office tomorrow at 5 o'clock. And she said, well, I'm going to have to check with my supervisor on that. And my assistant said, ma'am, the chancellor is your supervisor. She is everyone's supervisor. She said, well, fine, but I'm gonna bring my lawyer to the meeting. He said, bring whoever you have to bring, just show up at 5 o'clock. So the next day she, walks in and I come into the conference room and I said, so I understand you have a question about whether you should come to the meeting or not. She said, no, that was my bad. I was just nervous. I didn't know what to do. I said, okay. So I sat down at the table with her and I showed her the files and I said, this kid, you didn't have a meeting. You were supposed to have this kid, the form. I said, help me understand what happened, because with these 2 mistakes, you cost this district nearly $500,000. And she looked at me and she said, well, you need to understand that I am a very busy person. She said, I have too many kids in my caseload. I have so much paperwork to do, and things are going to fall through the cracks. That's just the way that it is. And I looked at her and I said, no, you need to understand that if you believe this job is too big for you, then you need to go find another job. But if you are going to take the paycheck home every other week, then you have to commit to taking the full responsibility over your entire job and doing it well.